Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference, both for coordinating this wonderful event on the important figure of Rabbi David Tzvi Hofman, and also for inviting me to speak on this panel. I would like to express my regrets that I am not able to present this in person. Rest assured, nothing less than a global health crisis could have kept me away from this intellectual feast. I would also like to apologize to this audience in Israel for presenting this lecture in English. I look forward to the day when my Hebrew is proficient enough to deliver a 20-minute lecture with grace and felicity. Until such a day arrives, I'm afraid I will be limiting myself to my mother tongue. I thank you in advance for your patience. If there is one thing that will have become clear from today's proceedings, it is that Rabbi David Tzvi Hofman was a multifaceted, complex, and roundly accomplished thinker, whose intellectual output ranged across a broad array of fields. Today, I intend to focus on Rabbi Hofman the halachist, in the sense of both his role as a legal authority and as a consequential trailblazer in the realm of halachic procedure. I will proceed to explore Hofman's halachic methodology and ideology microcosmically, that is, through a specific pair of tshuvot, or halachic case studies, that exemplify and highlight some of the salient features of Hofman as a halachic decisor. Of course, many of my observations will be building on the work of previous scholars in this field. I would like to make a special mention of the work of my old mentor, Dr. Daniel Gordis, whose PhD thesis was entitled The Legal Writings of Rabbi David Tzvi Hofman and Their Philosophical Foundations, and was submitted to the University of Southern California the month before I was born, which is still the best exploration of this topic that I have come across and forms the foundation of some of my remarks today. The pair of teshuvot that I wish to consider today were written by Rav David Tzvi Hofman in response to the following query. Are women permitted to participate, either as voters or as candidates, in elections within the Jewish community? Before outlining Hofman's answer, it must be noted that these teshuvot, written and published in the year 1919, have two unusual qualities that are important for our purposes. First, it usually requires much painstaking and meticulous work in order to deduce the precise historical, intellectual, and socioeconomic background of any given piece of halachic literature. Not so in this case. The years of 1917 to 1919 were extraordinary years of social upheaval throughout the West. In the wake of World War I, monarchies had fallen, democracies had risen, and entire nations were created anew. During this short period, the extension of the franchise to all adults, regardless of their gender, had become a central social priority for many nations, with Russia, Ukraine, Holland, Austria, Belgium, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and finally the United States, all granting women the right to vote. Similarly, the constitution of the newly created German Republic, also known as the Weimar Republic, granted both active and passive suffrage, that is, the right to vote and the right to stand as a candidate, to all adults regardless of gender. Thus, in the year 1919, when the leaders of German Jewish communities turned to Hofman for his opinion on this subject, there is undoubtedly a social and ideological subtext to this question. Put simply, the question considered by Hofman in these teshuvot was not necessarily about female suffrage as such, but rather as to whether halachic Judaism was commensurate with this modern wave of female emancipation. The second interesting quality of these two teshuvot is that they were not part of Hofman's classic compilation of legal decisions, his Melamed Lehoil. These two teshuvot were in fact written in German and were published in the Orthodox monthly journal Yeshurun, volume 6, in the year 1919. As such, these teshuvot have remained somewhat hidden from halachic scholars, even those who greatly admire Hofman's work. If I may be permitted a brief personal aside, the location and language of this teshuvah actually had an interesting recent consequence. Earlier this year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we had the pleasure of welcoming a senior Rosh Yeshiva, or rabbinic dean of Yeshiva University, to the Harvard campus, and him and I fell into conversation, and he told me that several years ago he was involved, or he was the head of a task force, I believe on behalf of the Rabbinic Council of America, to clarify their position on women being members of shul, the board of shul board, or president of the shul board. So I mentioned to him the tshuva of Rav Hofman on the subject, which I had recently been researching, and he looked at me strangely and he said, "No, Rav Hofman does not have a responsa on this subject. He's read the Melamed Lahoel Kava to Kava and couldn't find any tshuva of Rav Hoffman on the subject. I told him, this tshuva does exist, but it's in German and was published in the journal Yeshurun, and therefore even a halachic expert like the Rosh Yeshiva in front of me would not necessarily have come across it. And he looked at me somewhat ruefully and said, I wish I would have known that at the time. Our whole position might have been different. And I suppose we learned from this that even senior halachic experts could do with consulting academics, humble academics, from time to time. Anyway, returning to our purposes, these tshuvot are also broader in scope than an average halachic response, in that they consider additional historical and sociological elements pertinent to the question, as shall be described below. The unusual location, language, and content of these two tshuvot, which are very much styled in the format of a traditional halachic responsa, underscores the fact that these two texts transgress the usual boundaries of legal responsa and contain elements of social and philosophical import. In both tshuvot, Hofmann offers his opinion in a forthright, uncompromising, and well-sourced manner. In the first tshuva, he notes that he can find no halachic basis to prevent women from voting, but he argues at length, based on the rabbinic injunction against women exercising srara, or political power, that women are forbidden from standing as candidates in communal elections. The second tshuva constitutes a response to the opinion of one of his rabbinic colleagues, the Oberrabbiner Dr. Bernhard Lobel Ritter of Rotterdam, who critiqued Hoffman's permissiveness in allowing women to vote. Hoffman is thus compelled to construct a halachic defense of the rights of women to vote, provided the community does not object to this change in custom. Interestingly, as an aside, these two tshuvot are later quoted approvingly by Chief Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi Herzog in his Techuka LeYisrael Al Pi HaTorah in defense of women's rights to vote in the new state of Israel. Of course, Rav Herzog went further than Rav Hoffman in allowing women the right to stand for political candidacy as well. Beyond these two unusual qualities outlined above, there are 5 important features of these two tshuvot that warrant our attention. These 5 features exemplify and provide insight into Hoffman's halachic methodology, his communal persona, and his personal characteristics. Point number 1. The first, relatively minor point of note occurs in Hoffman's opening statement to the second of these tshuvot, in which he censures his critics, including Oberrabbiner Ritter, for their excessive reliance on svara, or halachic logic, in arriving at their conclusions. For Hoffman, the application of svara is no match for a careful consideration of all the relevant sources, which in this case includes passages from the halachic midrash, Sifrei and Mechilta, from the Jerusalem Talmud tractate Kiddushin, from Maimonides' Laws of Kings and Their Wars, and from several later commentators. Although Hoffman devotes some of his time to refuting the reasoning of his critics, he devotes far more time to marshalling the necessary sources to buttress his case. Number 2. The second point of note is that these tshuvot reflect Hoffman's complex consideration of established communal practice as a factor within his halachic reasoning. On the one hand, like many Ashkenazic decisors before him, Hoffman assumes that the practice of the community has significant halachic value and ought to be presumed to be legitimate unless there is strong evidence to the contrary. It is for this reason that the actual practices of various communities are adduced as legitimate halachic evidence for the question of women's suffrage. Hoffman notes that neo-Orthodox synagogues of both Berlin and Frankfurt am Main distinguish, as he himself does, between passive and active suffrage. And in an addendum to the second tshuva, he reports that women in Austrian communities have been permitted to vote, albeit by proxy, since 1882. In a similar vein, Hoffman takes it upon himself to interpret the customs of other communities in a favorable light. He claims, perhaps a tad charitably, that most communities who refuse to grant women the right to vote do so not out of principle, but rather because women do not contribute financially to the community and therefore ought not to have a say in communal matters. I must say, on a personal note, as a British student living within a few miles of Boston Harbor, I am keenly sensitive to issues of taxation and representation. Furthermore, as stated earlier, Hoffman insists that communities must be the final arbiter of all changes to policy, and that even positive and necessary developments, such as the introduction of female suffrage, requires sanction from the community as a whole. On the other hand, Hofman does not believe that all communal practices are inviolable. He feels licensed to criticize communities in Poland and Lithuania who have allowed women to stand for office and who therefore, in his eyes, have contravened Jewish tradition. Throughout these tshuvot, Hofman carefully demarcates the difference between an officially sanctioned minhag, which does carry halachic weight, and communal practices which are simply conventional and thus may evolve under the necessary circumstances. Therefore, claims Hofman, it is the duty of the halachic authority to delineate the precise boundary between the permitted and the forbidden, such that the communities might have the independent flexibility to shape the contours of their own practices within the boundaries of the legal imperative. The crucial paragraph, which appears at the end of the second tshuva, reads as follows, translation mine, quote, "This much is certain, that as long as there are no legal provisions to the contrary, circumstances may arise in the present time which may imperatively demand a change of the old practice." End quote. Hofman views the practice of excluding women from voting as just such an ephemeral and contingent community practice that does not rise to the level of minhag and therefore can be dispensed with in this new era of social sensibility. Intriguingly, Hofman reads this kind of halachic maneuverability into the rabbis of the Second Temple era. He quotes a passage from the Sifrei indicating that these sages accepted the de facto sovereignty of a woman, Queen Salome Alexandra, who inherited the crown from her husband Alexander Yaneos, or Yana HaMelech, in the year 76 BCE. This precedent, of course, must be explained away by Hofman, for whom the acceptance of a female sovereign is halachically problematic. Yet it is precisely his explanation that the rabbis accepted this queen since she merely inherited the throne and wasn't appointed to it herself, which demonstrates the possibility for hermeneutical and legal flexibility on this subject. Number 3. The third point of note in these tshuvot is Hofman's utilization of extra halachic sources. As I'm sure has been explored by other presenters at this conference, Hofman could claim considerable proficiency in the methods and conclusions of the critical scholarship of his day, and frequently assimilated, adapted, or repudiated this scholarship within his own writings. However, in his compilation of traditional responsa, Melamed Leho'il, Hofman shies away from using data or insights gleaned from scholarship outside the rabbinic canon. Indeed, in his introduction to this work, Hofman takes pains to explain that the forthcoming responsa, written in Hebrew, ought to be considered works of pure Torah, which have not been adulterated by external concepts or nomenclature. However, in the Talmudic and halachic novellae collected at the end of each volume of Melamed Leho'il, Hofman does apply the methods and results of critical academic scholarship when it suits his own ends. Here too, in our two tshuvot, Hofman turns to the scholarship of the ancient historian Josephus, specifically his work Antiquities, on 2 occasions. Hofman uses the ancient Jewish historian to show that Queen Salome Alexandria only received the throne on the death of her husband, and that she was apparently merely a puppet of the rabbis, reinstating Pharisaic law for all those under her dominion, and thus incurring the gratitude and loyalty of the rabbinic elite of her time. Based purely on this evidence from Josephus, whom Hofman clearly considers a reliable source of ancient fact, Hofman proceeds in his halachic analysis. The legitimization of a non-halachic source is most unusual, and perhaps explains why this tshuva never became part of Hofman's official halachic oeuvre. Nonetheless, it does demonstrate, both in theory and practice, Hofman was capable of including external scholarship in his halachic reasoning, although perhaps only on rare occasions, and perhaps only when the question itself entailed particularly intricate political and social considerations. Point number 4. The fourth, and perhaps most important point, concerns Hofman's occasional propensity towards post-facto halachic reasoning. As demonstrated at length in the 4th chapter of Daniel Gordis's doctoral dissertation, Hofman's halachic decision-making process was both expansive and open-ended enough to include the consideration of extra-legal principles, such as various social, political, and religious desiderata. Such considerations include the advancement of Jews within German society, the importance of having the Jewish religion being considered as admirable within wider society, and the retention of Jews who might otherwise abandon the community. All of these were deployed as justifications, usually subtle and implicit, for a variety of rulings. It was due to such considerations, for instance, that Hofman defines both secular schooling and military service as a mitzvah, a religious commandment. He permits Jews to take an oath in court on the Sabbath. He defends the donation of Jewish money to Christian charitable causes and radically redefines halachic definitions such as a public Sabbath desecrator, Michal Shabbat B'Farhesia. The evidence is considerable that Hofman could, when the occasion necessitated, stretch halachic definitions, categories, and texts in order to facilitate the achievement of these crucial extra halachic ends. I would like to argue that this pair of tshuvot that we have been discussing also falls into this category, but only partially. Writing in the year 1919, Hofman was well aware that the newly declared Weimar Republic had just enfranchised all adult women in consonance with the social and political climate of post-war Europe. Hofman, wishing to allow for the Jewish communities to function equally in such a society, used creative and unusual forms of halachic argumentation in order to give his imprimatur to those Jewish communities that extended the franchise to its female members. However, Hofman was unwilling to allow such social considerations to overturn what was, in his eyes, a plain text prohibition against women standing for office and thereby exercising srara, or political power within the community. These two tshuvot exemplify the central tension within Hofman's ideology, the poles of tradition and modernity between which he and his scholarship vacillates. Number 5. The fifth and final point of note in these two tshuvot is Hofman's disarming humility, which is evidenced throughout these two texts. At the start of his second tshuvah, he almost apologizes for his intervention on this topic, noting that he only proffered his initial opinion under the impression that no other rabbinical figures had weighed in on this matter. As mentioned earlier, he gave expansive space for communal independence and maintains the importance of communal input and ratification throughout any process of change involving public policy. Finally, at the end of his second tshuvah, he clarifies that he does not intend to compel anyone to accept his view, but rather wishes to add a dissenting, and I might add progressive and permissive, voice to this conversation, and, as Hofman finishes, habocher yivchar. While hardly revolutionary, this instinctive humility reflects the minds of a halachic authority who is far more interested in fostering peace and collective well-being than molding communal practice to his personal standards. In sum, therefore, these two somewhat hidden tshuvot reflect some of the salient facets of Hofman's halachic methodological and ideological priorities. They present us with a complex, multifaceted, and ultimately moderate posek halakha, who succeeds in maintaining both a stringent and a lenient stance on an issue of great social and communal consequence. Through his punctilious consideration of sources, his respect for communal practice, his judicious use of non-rabbinic scholarship, his openness to extra halachic considerations, and his impressive humility, Rabbi David Tzvi Hofman has provided an important example for future halachic authorities. I thank you for your time and attention.
אני רציתי לשאול, כבר שאלתי אותו בפרטי, כי לא ידעתי אם יהיה זמן לשאול, האם בכל הזמן הזה של החילופי מכתבים בין ברלין לבוקרשט, אם אפשר למסור את הגט לאישה או אי אפשר, האם מישהו חשב על זה שיש פה איזו אישה שמחכה לגט הזה, או שהם המשיכו להתווכח עד אין סוף?
עד עצם היום הזה. שכדאי הרב פה זו שאתה תענה, כי מעניין איזה תשובה זה אחרת לגמרי.
דברים מדברים בעד עצמם,
הוא אמר לי שהוא לא יודע כמה זמן היא חיכתה.
זה סוג של שלום בית.
יש פה שאלה.
כן, כן, ודאי.
יכול להיות, כנראה שלא שאלו את זה, שהייתי חייב לצאת לקראת הסוף, אבל למה השאלה הזאת עלתה בדיוק בתקופה הזאת? הרי יהודים משתמשים בשמות של גויים מימי בית שני, בכל הקהילות ובכל התפוצות, לאורך כל התקופות. למה השאלה בדיוק עלתה עכשיו? מן הסתם היו ויכוחים על כתיב של שמות לועזיים בגיטים מאז ומעולם.
נכון, זו באמת שאלה חשובה ויש לשאלה הזאת היסטוריה ארוכה. מה שמעניין בהקשר הזה זה שפתאום היחס, כמו שמחקרים על המודרניות ועל דברים, תופעות שהיו לפני כן מובנות מעליהם, הופכות פתאום להיות המקרה מבחן שדרכו מסתכלים מי בפנים, מי בחוץ, או מי מוציא את עצמו. יש לו לרב הופמן תשובה מעניינת על שם של ישעיהו, שהוא מפנה לבית הקברות, ללכת לראות את המצבה של האבא של יש שני צדדים של מצבה, בעצם צד אחד כתוב בלועזית וצד אחד בעברית, והוא היחס, זאת אומרת, מה שקורה גם בהונגריה וגם בגליציה, שפתאום זה נתפס כשינוי השם, כמשהו שיהודים עושים בשביל להיות חילונים, בשביל לצאת ולכן הדבר הזה צובר כל כך הרבה כעסים ודיונים על היחס הזה, למרות שאתה צודק שכמובן שמות היו, יש להם היסטוריה ארוכה של יהודים שמנהלים חיים בשני מרחבים וצריכים לדעת את היחסים. כשבאשכנז הדבר הזה הוא תמיד יותר משמעותי, וגם יש הבדל בפתרון שנקרא וכל שום דאית לי. זאת אומרת, היה נוסחה שנכתבת בגט, האיש הזה וכל השמות שיש לו. והדבר הזה כאילו משתנה ומייצר את הדיונים האלה.
תודה רבה.